Just imagine. You have no name. You have no memory of any relatives or lineage save the people you see in front of you at this moment. You don't have a home or any kind of place to call your own. You have no choice, no voice. You don't even eat what you want or when you want. You don't talk until you're told you may. You are invisible. You are, as one would say in the 18th century, ephemera, in the sense you just don't exist, except at the master's will. Welcome to slavery in America in the 19th century. This book for C-SPAN and the Library of Congress that we're going to examine today is Frederick Douglass's first biography. And we've decided to entitle this segment Frederick Douglass and Beyond: Words, Wisdom, Strength, and Vision for All Americans. This first autobiography covers the years 1818 to 1838. And as we move forward, you will find that, as always, we will move into the 20th and 21st centuries of how Douglass echoes. But first, let's talk about Douglass. This is a man who decided, once he had his own visibility and his own power, to record himself, his own experiences. This is why it's so important. One of the reasons I so love Gen Zers, their memories. They keep them, they note them, they talk about them, they write about them. And Douglass was no different. Douglass decided that he was going to, if ever afforded the opportunity, to tell his story. He was not alone. What's so interesting about American letters in the 19th century is that the slave narrative is born. And it is born not just in writing, as Douglass's first, second, and third autobiographies are. They are spoken. In other words, those people who were able to escape from slavery, they told their stories to all types of audiences: white, black, brown, American, European. They told their stories so that everyone would know. There would be a record where everyone could know that at one time in the United States of America, 4 million souls were in slavery. And that was only one population of blacks in America. You had the freedmen who had been freed and because they had run away, and then you had those who had never experienced a day of slavery, the freemen. We're going to explore all of that because Douglass experienced all of them. So let's start with, how did he get here? Douglass was born in 1818 on Home Hill Farm. His mother, Harriet, his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, were all there, as was his father, Aaron Anthony, both father and slave owner. He owned the plantation on which Frederick was born. And in that sense, Frederick's fate was already sealed as he was growing in his mother's womb. He had no choice from the beginning. And he and his siblings, he had siblings, were moved around, which was common for slave owners to move their slaves. So born in 1818, by 1824, Douglass and his siblings are moved to Wye River. And from there, they move again in 1826 to Baltimore. And at this point, what's so important about the 1826 move is that Douglass's mother dies, Anthony dies, and he meets Sophia and her husband, Hugh Auld. Now that's important. It's important because Douglass begins to understand that reading is important. And it's Sophia who brings this to the fore with him. And I want to read you a passage. There's a point where Douglass says that when the overseers and the slaveholders, the owners, just like his biological father, when they look at people like him, like Frederick, they see nothing. They see a body. They see a worker. They see a thing. And what struck Douglass about Sophia is the following. She did not deem it impudent or unmannerly for a slave to look her in the face. The meanest slave was put fully at ease in her presence, and none left without feeling better for having seen her. Her face was made of heavenly smiles, and her voice tranquil music. That's interesting, because when Sophia's husband, Hugh, finds out that she's teaching this boy, this black slave boy, to read, Hugh goes into orbit, and it is worth reading the passage so that we totally understand where he's coming from and why. Mr. Auld found out what was going on and at once forbade Ms. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. To use his own words, he said, quote, "If you give a nigger an inch, he'll take an ell. A nigger should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. Now, if you teach that nigger," speaking of myself, "how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy." Douglass's response here is very interesting. He says, "These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was just what I wanted, and I got it at a time when I least expected it. I set out with hope and a fixed purpose, at whatever the cost of trouble, to learn how to read." Now, we as English language arts teachers and social studies teachers and elementary teachers and preschool teachers, we understand the whole concept and the power of reading. We know this. And Douglass understood it. And what was fascinating about it was after Hugh told his wife to cease and desist, she turned cold to Frederick. She wasn't the same woman he described at the beginning of his autobiography. And I want to stop here and explain why this autobiography, or why this genre, is so important. Unlike biography, and we teach both types in our classrooms, the biography is a third party coming into somebody else's life, going through papers, pictures, interviews, whatever. Sometimes the person is living, sometimes the person is dead, on whom the biography is based. The autobiography, though, now that is different. The autobiography is first person and, are you ready? Third person. It is third person observant. Think about it. I just read you a passage where this young kid, this beleaguered young boy, remembered everything that he heard, and he recorded it years later as an adult. That is the brilliance of an autobiography written well, because it has both the tension, it has the drama, it has the awfulness, in this sense, the awfulness of what was happening around him or her in other cases at the time. For this case, we are experiencing Frederick Douglass's worst, his best, his most frightening, his most frustrating, his most combative times, trying to escape slavery, an institution that at one time literally held 4 million black souls here, in addition to the smaller group of freedmen who had run away, and an even smaller group of freemen and women who were never into slavery. We'll get into that, but I want us to understand that we're talking 3 separate groups here, mainly because students usually ask me, well, why didn't they just run? Well, see, that's the mindset of a 20th and 21st century student. I want to go, so I'm going to go. I'm going to get in the car and go. There was no car. There was no choice. There was no going. But once one decided to go, there was the danger. There was the problem. There was death, potentially. So it's at this time when he's in Baltimore that Douglass decides that he is really going to start thinking about how can he get away. It's also at this time his mother dies, his biological father, plantation owner, dies, Aaron Anthony. His grandmother's still taking care of him, but he also decides that he's going to start and continue reading. That's very important to him. And some of the books that he read, it was so interesting that he wanted to read John Quincy Adams' whole idea of slavery and bringing to the Congress this idea of somehow addressing the issue. It's also when after he leaves Baltimore and he finally arrives in his last destination, St. Michael's, Maryland, when he is sold yet again to Thomas Auld. Douglass, that little bit of reading that he did and reading the idea of John Quincy Adams, he decides that he's going to keep running or die. And die is the key word there, because so many who did try did die, or the ones who didn't die were maimed for life. And it's very important when students ask me that I tell them the truth about that, of what could happen, what were the penalties that were wrought on to slaves who tried to run, and the images of the beatings and the maimings. So to calm Frederick Douglass into being a good slave, the Aulds decided that they would rent him out to Edward Covey, known as, quote, the slave breaker. And Douglass, what happens next is going to be a surprise to you. The next segment is going to be not just what Douglass does as he is given to, quote, the slave breaker, but who are the other people who influence Douglass and help him make that decision that I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it, or die trying. The reputation of the South has suffered because we have allowed rhetoric to usurp our history. That is a direct quote from a Southern writer who wrote fiction about the glories of slavery in Old Virginia by Thomas Nelson Page. I made it my business over the years to collect all of his works because I wanted to see, to compare and contrast just how one could mold and frame how great slavery was. And no one actually does it better and worse for one who is a Southerner than Thomas Nelson Page. That brings us back to the validity and the import of the slave narrative. Not a fictional piece, not an autobiography, but the narratives themselves. And so we come to this second part of the background. What shaped, who shaped, what times shaped Frederick Douglass to become the orator, the thinker, the publisher, the activist, the womanist, and the American who wanted to fight for our country, whose sons fought for our country. what created this man? And we have to go back to the grandmother because she reared him. And we have to think, too, not about all the positive people. We have to think about the not positive people. His own father, Anthony. Aaron Anthony shaped his son just as much as his mother molded him. Every lash, every invisible moment, every line of demarcation that Aaron Anthony put on his child was there, and it was immovable until his death. And others, I mentioned earlier, John Quincy Adams and the Anti-Slavery Association. The anti-slavery group was an important group. And John Quincy Adams' idea of the anti-slavery abolition in Congress, trying to move that through so that there would be no contradistinction to trying to free slaves. His reading, one of my favorites, Caleb Bingham's The Complete Orator, that was originally published in the 18th century, but Douglass reads a Boston version of it in the 1800s. And it's insatiable. To me, Douglass resonates the way I think English teachers read texts. We don't have to be in a real place to understand where the author is taking us. We go there because we're English teachers. And we can see it, we can smell it, we can taste it. That's what we do. What we try to do also is to help students also enter that world so that they can understand it, experience it from safe distances so that they aren't personally hurt or harmed. Douglass does the same thing with the Columbian Orator. He simply absorbs everything Bingham says about audience, purpose, occasion. Yes, there she goes again. But see, it's not Jocelyn this time, it's Caleb Bingham who's talking to Frederick Douglass. It's about how one phrases words. It's about the punctuation. It's about the tone. It's about the way you write, the way you speak. Bingham covers all of it. And what's so fascinating about 19th century rhetorical books like Bingham's, generally at the very beginning of the books, they would even tell you how to stand. So you would see footprints in terms of how one stands. How do you hold your arms? What do you do? So it was all about becoming the perfect messenger. How do you deliver that? How do you speak it? And so Bingham's Columbian Orator was very important. In addition, the fact that his siblings were all sold away. Remember, as we started, you don't have a choice. You just don't get it. It's not yours to get. Your family, as Aaron Anthony said and did, and as Hugh all told his wife, if you try to help them, if you try to train them, if you try to make them people like we are, then they won't be happy or usable anymore. And he was right. And so all of that helped to shape who Douglass was becoming. Not would become, but was becoming. He also found the love of his life, the first love of his life. He was married twice. So he found Anna Murray Douglass, and they married. The other important people who were in his life were those who finally helped him decide that he was going to run. And we're going to get into the running later because there's a part that I want to quote from the biography. But I want to really dive deeply into the people who helped Douglass. He understood the problems and the challenges. He understood that because he had tried to escape 2 times before and was caught. That's why he was given to the slave breaker and Covey. And Covey finally left Douglass alone when Douglass beat him within an inch of his life. And we find out at that point that you can't break the human spirit no matter how much you try to beat it up, pound it up, or just chop it up, which is some of the things that they did. Douglass kept going back. And the 3rd time was the charm. By the 3rd of September, 1838, Douglass was out. But he didn't get out alone. There were abolitionists who were helping him. And when I say abolitionists, I'm not talking about just men. I'm not talking about just black men, white men. I'm talking about women, black women, white men, white women, all over. There were churches. One that Giovanni and I really like in New York called the Little Church Around the Corner. We visited that church, not because only of the wanting to see the Underground Railroad that was there, the hidden pieces of underneath the church, the tunnels where they would hide the slaves, but because his parents were married there. So we wanted to go and see it. But it's something, when I walked in, knowing not only Giovanni's story, but the story of the Underground Railroad, being a child, a great-grandchild, and a great-great-grandchild of slaves, that church has a special meaning for me because I understood how the abolitionist movement and the abolitionists themselves were not immune to being hurt or killed, because many of them were. And some had as much as $50,000 bond on their heads to be caught. And we know that, just like Harriet Tubman. So you have all of these positive vibes around him, trying to help him. Names such as David Ruggles and James W.C. Pennington and William Lloyd Garrison, Susan B. Anthony, and Jarvis Langdon and the Langdon family. Now, some of you may not be familiar with the last name Langdon, but if you match it with Mark Twain, who married Olivia Langdon, the Langdons were staunch abolitionists. Douglass would eventually sit at their table and break bread. He and Jarvis would be fast friends, and it is Jarvis who helps him, along with others who were British and Scottish, to pay off the Alds over $700 for Douglass's freedom. So I want us to understand, and I want students to understand, that this idea, as students used to say, well, why didn't they just go up and run? I mean, I'd run. It wasn't that easy. It wasn't like that. It had to be planned, and it had to be a network of people to help the slaves run away. And the ones who remained didn't remain because they weren't adventurous enough or wanted to stay in slavery. They were fearful of their lives. But we will find out later in another segment how those slave communities were critical in the whole concept of the run. Because without those communities aiding the abolitionists on the outside, the slaves themselves would never have been able to survive. So Douglass had a number of influencers. And the fact that the British friends who purchased his freedom, the British and Scottish, for $711.66, paid for his freedom, got him a passport, and was able to give him papers so that he could change his name because he knew that they would be looking for him and trying to catch him and bring him back, and that there was a bounty. We will delve deeply into that part as Douglass talks about it in his narrative. But again, think about how we began. Even your breathing is at the pleasure of someone who owns you. And what Douglass fought for, and the others who fought as well, whom we will meet, some you'll see, were the ones who said, we don't care if we get another breath. What we care about is breathing freely. See you on the other side. Too often when we hear the word slavery or think about the word slavery, people, it seems to me, some, I won't say all, have an immediate sense of, I know what it is. I know what it was. And I sometimes, and more often now, think that that's just, it's almost as though we're looking through a monocle through slavery rather than the panorama of slavery. Slavery came in many different forms. It was not dealt with in the same ways. It was divisive or divisive even among slaves themselves, depending on where they worked. And in Douglass's first autobiography, he actually observes that. So you remember I said that an autobiography is not just personal, it's not just first person, it's also third person observant. And this autobiography, helps us to really see and understand the multi-layers of slavery. And Douglass takes his time to describe them as he begins his travels, and I put that in quotation marks, of being sold hither and yon to finally settling in Baltimore. And so let's look at the iterations of slavery, the locations, for example. So now we're in the, quote, the historical snapshot of it. What was Douglass's historical snapshot, his scenery, his living day to day? What did that look like? And as he escaped, what did he see? When he finally became free, what did he see? And first, it's the whole concept of the slave as chattel. A slave in the United States meant just what we talked about earlier. Nothing. You had nothing. You were nothing. You were invisible. My ancestors, same thing. Nothing. Your name isn't your own. So suffice it to say, this is a little insight of Jocelyn. When I first started my career and I would go to conferences, my papers would be accepted for me to read, of course, but when they saw me and put the name Chadwick with my face, there was always this vacant look, and I learned how to read that vacant look. And while my father died when I was 10, I would always call my mother and say, "You won't guess what happened today." Again, they looked at me like, "So yes, I'm Jocelyn Chadwick. That is my name." This is exactly what Douglass talks about in his book. And so going back and rereading it again, I had to smile thinking, yeah, I'm familiar with that. His concept of slavery, he breaks down into those who are on the rural farms, the plantations, and those who are in the field they're less than invisible. They're just entities. They are work entities. They are work horses. They don't merit good food. They don't merit good water. They don't merit break time. This idea of we've lived on the East Coast for some time. Unions abide. Still in, other states like my home state, Texas, there are no unions. You just keep working. And so for slaves in the rural parts of the South, they kept working. But those in the rural South who were house slaves, very different experience, as young Frederick experiences with Sophia, because she begins to teach him how to read until her husband steps in and says, "This has got to stop. He is a slave. At the end of the day, he is nothing. He is nothing but chattel. He is not human." That's what he's not human. Think about that. Just let that soak in a moment. He has a heart like they do. He has a body as they do. He has all of the internal organs as they do, but still he is not human. And so the inside slaves, generally women, were treated very differently, and they looked different. Generally, they were the lighter-skinned blacks. It was not fair. There was nothing fair about slavery, so we can't go there. But it also created a schism between the house slaves and the field slaves. The city slaves, as Douglass talks about when he goes to Baltimore and he begins to see them, he says, there's a difference here. They seem to have a purpose. They seem to be calm. They seem to be somewhat accepted, but they're still slaves, but they have a direction. And he, again, observer, and he's recording. The idea of the overseer. The overseers were those like Covey. They were brutal. They were frustrated because they didn't own the plantation. So they took the frustration out on the slaves because they weren't as, quote, big as they wanted to be. So they could beat up on the help. And they mistreated the women, they mistreated the children, and they mistreated the men. Then you get into the idea of those who were enslaved, but then the ones who were just free from the beginning, never knew a day of slavery. And this is one category that always frustrated me as I taught in Irving and even with graduate students, because there's a gap in that history. It's as though they weren't aware of these people. And that really bothered me. And so I was so happy when Henry Louis Gates came out with his 19th century collection of black women writers, because he made them visible again. And what still frustrates me to this day is that they're still invisible. For example, Anne Plato, a brilliant poet who lived in New York, and she was born free. Her poetry is absolutely stunning, but she's not included in the curricula because too many people are unaware that she existed. And Elizabeth Keckley, she was a former slave, but she was also Abraham Lincoln's wife's seamstress. So she was in the White House. And you have my favorite guy, Henry Box Brown. Students love his story, so I always make sure to tell Henry's story. Henry wanted to be out so badly that the abolitionists, people like William Steele, gathered together and thought of a way to get him out. Running didn't mean getting in your car or getting on your bike or getting on your motorcycle and just hitting the streets. Running meant weeds, woods, by any means necessary. And for Henry Brown, it was literally inside a box. And for most of that journey from the south to the north, he was on his head in that box. And in William Steele's book, he illustrates how Henry Box Brown was uncrated and he comes out of the box. And Henry then, like so many, just like Frederick Douglass, takes to the lecture circuit with his box to tell his story. So again, the slave narrative becomes real, and there's nothing those in the South, remember Thomas Nelson Page, there's nothing those in the South can say or do when these people are coming out and showing their scars, showing their boxes, showing their mutilated bodies, and telling their stories. And you have others like Sojourner Truth and Richard Allen, who becomes not only a minister and an activist, but a part of the abolitionist movement. Harriet Jacobs, brilliant. She writes her own slave narrative. And what's so fascinating about her, and you'll see some of the images, we saw an exhibit that literally toured the world of a tribute to Harriet Jacobs. And so you'll see some of those images of how kids actually created that artwork that made it not only in the United States, but also toured Europe. And another, Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth. Harriet Tubman at one point had $50,000 on her head as a bond, and she was known as Moses, a nice biblical reference. Again, this is the history, and so many people are unaware of that history of those people who had been slaves but who escaped slavery, and how they didn't just go, as my mother used to say, sickling on down the street. They turned those energies back into getting others out, up to the point where Harriet Tubman said to some of them, "If you stop, I will shoot you. You have to keep going." And that was the whole point. Sojourner Truth actually helped with she did the same thing as Harriet Tubman, as she helped with the military, with the Civil War. She was just a fighter. So we had strong women, strong men. We had white women, white men. John Greenleaf Whittier was another. No one really thinks about John Greenleaf Whittier as anything but a poet, but he was an abolitionist. And so was John Brown, a great abolitionist, and so was, we talked about Jervis Langdon. So you have a number of people. You have the slaves trying to escape. You have the free men and women who were never slaves, who are trying to help the cause. And then you have the abolitionists, those who were slaves, those who were not slaves, those who were white, who come together to make sure that the idea of the Underground Railroad works, and that slaves are made free, and that they can get out of slavery. And as we've said before, it wasn't easy. And you will see some of the pamphlets, you will see some of the some of these slave documents. We have one where a little girl, Hannah, is sold in perpetuity. Now, just let that settle for a moment. A little girl is sold in body and soul, according to the document, in perpetuity to a new owner. And she's a child who will have to bear children and will have to do the work. That's what we did. That's what happened in our country. And yes, we all have to embrace it. Black, white, brown, whoever lives here, that is part of our heritage that we must understand, and that Frederick Douglass brings out so clearly and keeps redacting it in subsequent autobiographies, as only a former slave could tell. The idea of the runaways, the runaway slaves, as I said earlier, students would say, why didn't you just leave? Not possible. But the abolitionists started a system that they called the Underground Railroad, so that there would be so many stations along the way. And what was a station? A station could be a house. A station could be a church, like the little church around the corner that we talked about. A station could be within the woods. The slave catchers and dogs were always after them. And Douglass, once he became a publisher, called them out with images, names, the whole 9 yards. You'll see that. More importantly, the slave communities. Without those slave communities, the quarters, so to speak, sometimes leaving pies and food out on a sill at night, knowing that slaves would come and eat it, that's what kept them going. They themselves couldn't run or were too frightened to run, but they could help the cause. And so those communities, the slave communities, were stronger than their white owners ever thought were possible. Because, to be honest, had they been found out, they too would have been killed or maimed. Douglass, his planned escape, his last attempt, chapter 11. We're going to pick it up there the next time, but that chapter is so riveting and so personal and so passionate about the concept of freedom. And as we go through it in part 3, think about what we talked about with Thomas Paine, when he was trying to convince the middle of the ground people and the folks who just want to stay safe that freedom isn't safe. You can't have freedom and stay safe. You have to try. You have to sacrifice. You have to have courage. And that's what Douglass does. And we start there next time. And what's so fascinating about that is the concept of the slave narrative, which we will talk about much later in the program, about the 20th and 21st century connections. The Library of Congress has a bevy of letters from freed slaves who wrote their stories. And so in the LOC is this collection of amazing stories of former slaves telling in their own words, their own dialect, how they speak of what their time was like and what freedom is like to them. So from the past, let's get back into a further past of Frederick Douglass. The oral tradition, Douglass was spectacular in telling not only his story, but also making the audience see a face. And we've discussed this with the other slaves, and you've been seeing images of them who told their stories, who took to the lecture circuit. The written part, unlike some of the others, Douglass, sort of like Walt Whitman many years later, started writing this particular autobiography, but continued on for 2 more, so that he was a documentarian. In so many ways, his 3 volumes take us through such an amazing period of time, from a slave-driven United States of America to a free United States of America, not just for slaves, but for women and for other people. All of that set the stage for where we are in 2024. And so this idea of the slave narrative and of Frederick Douglass and how he writes his pieces, so very important. The other part about this slave narrative is that it ends in a parody. So thank goodness Who knew that Frederick Douglass would give me a moment to be able to use something that I actually studied and wrote my dissertation on, Menippean satire. So for those of you who know me very well, say, oh God, here she goes again. Just let me have a moment. Because this parody at the end of the first narrative is important for students to be able to see and to understand the contradistinction that Douglass creates here. He takes pious Christian Americans who go to church every Sunday and they read their Bibles and they say that they are good people, those who own slaves. And then he takes and changes ever so slightly what it is they really do. So just let me read a portion of it to you. Come, saints and sinners, hear me tell how pious priests whip Jack and Nell, and women buy and children sell, and preach all sinners down to hell, and sing of heavenly union. They'll bleat and baa, donna like goats, gorge down black sheep and strain at moats, array their blacks in fine black coats, then seize their Negroes by their throats and choke for heavenly union. They'll church you if you sip a dram, and damn you if you steal a lamb, yet rob old Tony, Doll, and Sam of human rights and bread and ham. That's important because there's a humor there that is a serious humor. I think when we, on a daily basis, think of humor, we think of funny, haha, we're making a joke. But when one is writing in satire and is trying to make a point, sometimes that humor can be a kind of biting humor without actually telling you what you're supposed to think. It presents the argument. And that's what is called Menippean satire. The argument is presented. It's up to the reader to be discerning enough to understand what the underlying theme is about what's wrong with this particular portion of society at this particular moment. So that's my little mountain of Menippean satire, and it is brilliant. Remember, this is a guy who read Bingham's Columbian Orator. So he is very conscious, very cognizant of the power of words, of the power of how you punctuate it, the power of how you create a sentence or the repeat or whatever. And so now we're getting into that point. Douglass is aware, not only in the written portion of his narrative, but also in the oral portion and in this parody, that it's all about audience. And again, I repeat, his audience was a staggered audience. It was a free white audience. It was a free black audience. It was an enslaved black audience that heard through the grapevine. Just because the slaves were in their quarters and being beaten or misused did not mean that they did not have a hand or an ear on the communication. There was communication going around all the time. And the slaves always knew more than the masters thought they knew. And so with that, you have the idea of, now I have my audience, but I also have this occasion. What is the occasion? This occasion is an America where Thomas Paine talked about, where there was equity for everyone, where there was a respect for everyone. And yet you have 4 million souls enclosed and encased in slavery. That's not what Thomas Paine discussed. And so Douglass's audience was a wide audience of trying to awaken those who could see that there was something not right. Remember, he had already, before he even ran away towards freedom, he had been aware of John Quincy Adams' petitions to stop the gag order in Congress that would prevent women and free blacks and slaves from speech. And Quincy Adams just simply did not give up. He just continued to fight back. So that is part of how Douglass's narrative shows its purpose. And the occasion, well, the occasion is, it's time. It's time for freedom. It's time that America stands up and lives up to what is in its own Constitution. And so, audience, purpose, and occasion. With those in mind, the thematic threads for me, as I have reread all of the 3 autobiographies, but certainly I've read this one especially closely, as has Giovanni, because we're doing this program. This one is about darkness at the very beginning, and then the hope of light, a shadow of light, and then complete enlightenment. And Douglass takes that enlightenment and he spreads it around to everyone. No one is outside of Douglass's reach, which is why he's so multifaceted in his pursuits. That it's not just the slave narrative, it's not just the lecture circuit, it becomes the journals, the newspapers, the speeches, the letters. So he's multifaceted. And what are some of these thematic threads? The very first one, go back to the 70s. There's some of you who are my age, and we can remember when that program was on and the advertisements were on about reading is fundamental. It's all about reading. If you were to read all of the slave narratives of this period, or read the letters that are from former slaves in the Library of Congress, the one common element among them all is that they wanted to read. I have a personal story to tell you, and it is personal. My mother's experience with the idea of slavery with her family. My mother, of course, was not a slave, neither was my grandmother, but my great-grandmother was, Ella. And Ella told a story about how her brother went out at night, which was common because in Douglass's narrative, he talks about he wanted to teach the slaves how to read, even under the guise of a Sunday school class. And so Ella's brother would go out at night into the quarters, and there was a place for them to learn to read. And the last thing she heard was a scream, and she never heard from her brother nor saw him again. So as we start with the concept of the thematic threads, think about the darkness, the light, and enlightenment of how reading, we as English and social studies teachers, reading really is more than just fundamental. It is the lifeblood of understanding. That's how we experience life, by our personal lives and the world, through the pages of a book, through a speech, through a poem. And so the idea that reading is basic, it is a right, it is something that we must have and must hone, is so important. Another thematic thread is home. What is home? Remember, we began by saying as a slave you didn't have a home. So what does that mean? Douglass only begins to understand it when he finally is successful in his run and is in Baltimore and is seeing different things happen and how blacks actually can be free and interrelate with other people and have homes, and he meets people who have homes and they are black. Home, let's define that. So on the other side, let's pick up the thematic threads and we'll keep going. So continuing the thematic threads, let's talk about, again, I've already mentioned home and we've discussed that, but also what's in a name. We all think about names that we assume that it's just rote, that we all have names, and of course the idea of having a legacy through family of names. But what if you didn't? What if you didn't have a legacy? What if you didn't know where you came from or how you got here or anything like that? That is the legacy that so many African Americans had when they were brought here, which is one of my distinctions when I am around folks who say, well, everyone's black. And I said, well, yes, that's correct. All black people are black, but African Americans are African Americans and black. We have a separate history here, and it is a very distinctive history. It is a history that I don't share with Haitians. I don't share with people in Africa. I share with the folks who were brought here and those generations. That history I have to understand or do my best so that I can be the person I am and also understand other people around me. So the idea of what's in a name is so very important. The idea of friends and family. Who defines that? What makes a family? Is it connections, DNA? You will find that among African Americans who were born in this country or brought to this country, community becomes a family. The slave quarters become family. The idea that you're not connected by blood or DNA, but you're connected by condition. You're connected by what is happening. You're connected by being together and trying to support one another. So the slave communities, the quarters, they may not have been able to read, they may not have been able to write, but they could feel, and they knew that they were a group, they were a cohort, they were a family of people together. The idea, too, of strangers becoming a kind of family. Douglass began having family when he finally was able to escape, and he met so many different people, and this is important, from all walks of life, of various ethnicities. They became a part of him as an extended family. So as we move through this autobiography, let's rethink what makes a family, because sometimes blood kin can be just as contentious, or even more so, than someone who has absolutely no blood connection whatsoever. So that's something to think about. The idea of being alone. If you're going to run, sometimes you're in groups, if you were led by Harriet Tubman, for example, but mostly runners were alone. What would it be like to be alone in the wilderness, hearing everything, every crack, every creak, knowing that something could absolutely happen to take you back to something that is so unspeakable, indescribable? And Douglass discusses it. He has to go through that idea of if he's going to run or not, and what would the consequences be. So the being alone is so important as a thematic thread. The idea of voice and identity. Slaves had no voice. They had no identity. As Douglass and William Garrison says, they were chattel, beasts of burden, nothing. They didn't feel anything. They didn't know anything. They were to be treated just as things. So the idea of voice and identity being invisible versus visible is a theme that runs through this first autobiography. The concept of seeing for the first time. Douglass sees, and that's why this autobiography, I call it third person observant, because he really is observant. He observes and notes the shift in Sophia as she sees him not as a slave initially, but as a person, and encourages him to look her in the eye and to talk with her until her husband comes and says, if you give her a nigger an inch, he'll take an L. And she changes, and Douglass records that change, how she becomes coarse and hard and just closes him out. So he sees, and he never loses that observing eye, which really serves him well throughout the entirety of his life. The idea of to run or not to run, we discussed this a little bit before. Running was no easy choice, because the punishments were sure and exact. For women, it was unthinkable. For men, chopping off parts of a body, not uncommon. Hanging, just as an idea of showing to the others what would happen if you decided to run. Dogs eating at you, biting you, the whole 9 yards. That is not an easy thing to take on. And Douglass, near the end of the first narrative, goes through that. It is a logical argument that he goes through, the pros and the cons of what happens if he does, what could happen if he doesn't, what happens if he tries to run and is unsuccessful. He works through all of that in his mind in a very persuasive, self-persuasive argument for why he should or why he shouldn't. The idea of tolerance and intolerance all around him. He doesn't understand the difference really between tolerance and intolerance until he starts out on moving to run, and he then begins to see what tolerance really looks like. If this sounds like, again, Thomas Paine, just let me give you a little primer back to what we did with Paine. Equity, courage, sacrifice, security, freedom, natural rights, and natural liberty. All of that is encompassed in this first narrative, and it's working through the mind and the heart and the soul of this child, this teen, this young man, as he is trying to find himself and a place in the United States of America. Ultimately, what Douglass is seeking, what all of those are seeking who choose to run and who want to run but are too fearful, is control. Control of one's own self, something that we today take as a given. But what if you didn't? What if you didn't have a choice? What if you didn't have a sense of your own direction of what you want to do? One of the ideas in America is if you try, you can accomplish anything. But for slaves, they could try and die and no one would care. It was a wisp in the wind. There was nothing there. There was no there for them. So there was no control over oneself. One was being controlled. Every move, every second, all the time. And finally, with this narrative and with the others that followed and with the lecture circuit, the theme kept coming back, but it's one that Douglass never left, even in his publishing and in his speeches and in his letters. What is freedom? We use that word, but when do we really think about the depth and the scope of that word? What is freedom? What does freedom look like? What does it smell like? What does it feel like? What does it taste like? And I'm very serious about that. All of those sensories, when we talk about our senses, I would love to hear, and I have heard from some students when we worked with Douglass and some high school students in particular, and some graduate students, but basically high school students, what does freedom mean to you? Because many of our students, especially my earlier ones, had never really thought about that because it was just a given. But Gen Zers are very different. They seem to not mind parsing. As a fact, they rather enjoy it. I think sometimes just to see how much we know or don't know. And I'm always saying, I don't know that, but give me a moment and I will find the answer for you. But seeing them ponder and pull apart what is freedom, to make them really slow down and think about that, is so important. And that in itself is what makes this narrative so worthy. Because unlike the other narratives, slave narratives, what Douglass's narratives do is that he shows us his mental working. He shows us how he is thinking. He shows us how he weighs the pros and the cons. He shows us how he argues with himself and weighs the balance. He shows us how he makes his decisions and then why that decision was made. And then he shows us his fear. He shows us and illustrates to us his concern and his fear. So on the other side of this, we're going to get into specifically how he creates this narrative using words. So the other part that's coming is the style, writing and speaking, the speakerly texts of the slave narrative. So here we're back talking about style, writing and speaking, the speakerly text. I'm going to go through the list, but you know that you'll have in depth the explications and the examples, but I want to go through them just briefly here because the way he writes his narrative is as though he's speaking to himself, an interior monologue, and he's speaking exteriorly to an audience. And that's what makes Douglass so unique. So his oratory, his rhetorical style, Douglass never fades away from that once he understands what Bingham is saying in the Columbian Orator. Oratory and rhetoric are so very important. I hear sometimes folks say, that's empty rhetoric. It's just rhetoric. Drives me absolutely over a mountain because rhetoric is how we communicate. It is action. It is verbal. It is physical. If we say hello, that is a rhetorical act expecting that someone will say hello back. In Texas, that was always the case. In New York, not always. I said hello once to a lady and she said something to me that was so foul, I just stood there for a second thinking, all I said was hello. And it was just mind-boggling to me that happened. But that's rhetoric. Rhetoric is communication. It can be negative, it can also be positive, and it can be powerful. And Douglass is a powerful rhetor. As we said, first person, third person narrative and observer. The narrative, he uses all four of them at the same time. He uses the narrative, the descriptive, the argumentative, and expository, which is important. The idea sometimes that we used to teach, and I'm only talking about myself, so I'm not pointing fingers at anyone. We were supposed to teach description. Well, how can you teach description if you don't include expository or you don't include the idea of a narrative? We have to. So all of them fit together. They're not separate. They can be combined effectively. The idea of irony here. I love this particular first narrative because Douglass so uses extremely well verbal, situational, and dramatic irony. And I want to point that out to you because as you read some of the arguments, and we're going to pull a little of a one out so that you can see what I'm talking about. Douglass actually has arguments within himself, and that's what we were talking about earlier. That's called a dialectic. And what do I mean by that? A dialectic is a two-sided argument that goes up and scaffolds up, basically trying to find the best answer ultimately. Where are we going to go with this? And that's a dialectic, the idea that it's a give and a take. It's not an argument, I'm going to pound you down until you yield. That is not a dialectic. A dialectic is an intelligent, scaffolded argument trying to weigh and consider what are the pros, what are the cons, what's going to be the final decision. And sometimes in a dialectic, you don't reach the final decision. And I want to say here, in so many ways, Frederick Douglass's, all of his autobiographies never reached the final decision of freedom and equity because we are still working on it. And so in so many ways, we're still in this amazing dialectic that Frederick Douglass's narratives set up. His slave narratives set up for us the argument. And we are still working through that dialectic, trying to talk it through, trying to work it through. So the idea of a Socratic dialectic is so important, I think, for students to understand, and for us too. His syntax, you can find all types of sentences in this narrative, and we will point them out. Figurative language, you got it. Metaphors, similes, he has comparison, contrast, examples, he has testimonials, all of it's here. The word choice of the period. So we're going to bring to you from the OED what those words meant at the time, like gip or like cowskin or chattel. Those are not words we use now, but those are words indicative of how language changes, how it morphs, and words come and they go. And that's important. The biblical references, the book of Daniel in the lion's den. This would be common in the 19th century, biblical allusions. And so Douglass is no exception. And the idea of Daniel in the lion's den suits his argument of how he feels about not only his predicament, but more importantly, about his deliverance. And it's all about deliverance. I get chills just even saying and thinking about that he chooses Daniel, this amazing scholar and seer and close to God, and Daniel in his faith that all will be well if he just stands the ground. That's Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass continues standing that ground until he falls down dead at the end of his life with his second wife at dinner after coming in from a lecture. And that's the kind of man he was, like Daniel. And ultimately, he has what I love to practice with students and have some fun with, repetition. You remember, I've told you over this time that we used to teach writing and say, repetition, no, stop that, no repetition. Well, that wasn't right. Of course, repetition can be used well. And here he has the old anaphora at the beginning, the simplicity where he's repeating at the beginning and at the end. But also something I love to experience with Gen Zers is anthemeria. Make up your own word. And as he said, and I had one in the parody, that people are churched to death. And church, of course, is a noun. He uses it as a verb. And so helping students understand that they can manipulate the language to say what they want to say, even if it goes against our grain of proper English or the way we were taught linguistics and grammar. So there'll be some activities that we have in the instruction and strategies to help students not only see and identify how not just Douglass, but even singers whom they listen and movies they see. All of these styles are there. Our students just don't know how to identify it and how to use it to their power in writing and speaking. And that's what we want them to do. Finally, allusion. We've had allusion in all three books that we've been examining. And here, I have to say, Giovanni teased me because I was so excited. I had forgotten that there was an allusion in the first narrative to Sir Walter Scott's Lady of the Lake. And I was going to Giovanni. I said, "Oh, the Lady of the Lake." And Giovanni said, "What? Calm down. Who reads that?" And I said, "Oh, please. It's still taught. Sir Walter Scott is still taught. Give me a break." But even if he's not taught in your district or you've never read it, it's important because here are Nathan and Mary Johnson who give a house or safety, sanctuary to Douglass, and they help him with the other abolitionists, and they tell him that he needs to change his last name because of slave catchers. Remember, that was a big deal during the period, being caught. The Fugitive Slave Act, the idea that there were bounties on the heads of these slaves who ran away, and Douglass in particular, because he had been known to be one to fight back. And so it's the Johnsons who say to him, "You need to change your name so that when they're looking for you, you won't have Douglass at the end of it." And they choose a character from Lady of the Lake, Sir Walter Scott's poem. So we will have that in there so that you can see that particular logic of why they chose a poem so that they could disguise their friend, their new friend, and protect him. And the key word here, as we come to the end of this section on text, the part that comes through in Frederick Douglass's first narrative and in all of the slave narratives, but particular this one, Douglass learns, there's a part in this particular narrative where he said he didn't think he could trust any white person, or then he says, or just anyone. And what he finds is that he can not only trust some white people to help him and to alleviate this onus of slavery, but there are Europeans, there are Brits, there are Scots who come to his aid during his lifetime to aid him, to help him, and that not all white people are those who want to enslave black people. He sees that. And of course, if you're in the South and you're in slavery, that's all you see. You don't know that there's another world out there. You have no clue. And that's what Auld was telling Sophia. Don't do it. If you let them read, if you let them know what the world is really like, they will be no good anymore for work and for just our doing what we want. And that once the genie is out of the bottle, you can't get it back. And that is the import and impact of this man. All the others were very important. Please understand, I read a bevy of slave narratives, but it is Frederick Douglass who runs the marathon here. Once he gets his narrative, this first one on the ground, he does not stop in the chronicling of trying to be the best anti-slave voice, image, the whole concept, and reaching out to any and every venue that will help coalesce this group. So for this powerful novel, I have the novel on the brain, for this powerful slave narrative that is a life story, let's keep moving on. So I'll see you the next time for instructional strategies, which we all love, and the challenges. What are the challenges to teaching this narrative, and when should it be taught? We're going to talk about that too, along with the primary and secondary resources. Here we are with the challenges of teaching Frederick Douglass's first narrative. My own concern about that is there was a time, and it still is for the most part, Frederick Douglass is required reading at certain grade levels, but it's excerpts. So, no, I'm not arguing for reading the entire autobiography. I would like to recommend that what we do at the elementary, middle, and secondary level is to read the narrative ourselves and try to think about each group of students, because students change from year to year, but which excerpts would you want to expose students to depending on the curricula? And that's for English language arts and social studies as well. So you want to give them a flavor not only of the period and the import of the slave narrative as a genre and as a historical fact, a moment in time, first person. And you also, though, want to allow students to experience the amazing skill of this man, and through his own words and through his own thoughts. So the excerpts you choose should, of course, fit the curricula. And in most of the states, practically in all of the states, the majority of the states, there is and has been for some time the convergence of social studies and English language arts, along with the other core content areas, but especially social studies and English language arts. So the idea is you want to capture passages that are resonant, that are indicative of the period, that also support the learning points that you need to hit. As we were talking about syntax, we were talking about figures of speech, we were talking about moments in historical time, we were talking about the Constitution. So pick those, and again, don't pick just one or two. Use multiple excerpts and then assign them to the groups. And this is going to be in the instructions, so you don't have to worry about it. But the idea is to spread out as much as you can, expose as much as you can parts of this particular narrative, especially in case they won't be reading the other two. So you want to give them a good depth and breadth as you can, and then let them report out on what's going on. So the excerpts, you want to be sure that you're picking and choosing. The other part to this is, of course, that we're going to bring in connections that Douglass made as a result of this first narrative with other people later in the 19th century, his own period, as well as connections he made in the 20th and 21st centuries. That's really important to create I don't want to use that, to refuse, to intertwine the connectedness of the past with the present and the future. So the idea of capturing instructionally the multifaceted Frederick Douglass in his time is the challenge with teaching this autobiography. And we're going to help you and help ourselves, because this has been a learning curve yet again for us of how he still speaks. The multifaceted pieces are what you want to think about when we're thinking about the total Frederick Douglass. In the making, in this first narrative, we see the slave child, we see the slave teen, we see the slave man, we see the freedman, we see the orator, the writer, we see the publisher, we see the activist who remained an activist in abolition all his life, the activist for women, we see a family man, and we see a friend. So we're going to explore all of those categories of these are connections, but they're challenges, and hopefully when we break down these parts that I've just listed for you with Frederick Douglass, these will help lessen the challenge and give you more of a choice of how you want to present this man in your classrooms, to let him be a three-dimensional person and not a flat picture or this one image, this one idea of just he was a slave and then he was free and then he wrote a lot. No. We want to give you a three-dimensional version of this man and his life and his time and the people whom he met and whom he touched and those who touched him. And we want to be sure that you have a panoply of choices so that You can choose here, you can choose this, you can choose that. And students will have, hopefully, a better idea of just how important Frederick Augustus Douglass was, is, and will continue to be. Here we are in Connections, 19th century, after 1838. We talked about Frederick Douglass's life up to this point, when he runs and he's free. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. But for books that shaped America, one key criteria has to be that the books continue to speak, continue to resonate, continue to have value. And that's so important. It's what makes a work live beyond its publication date. And so with Frederick Douglass and this first iteration of his slave narrative, told by himself of an American slave, he will have, during his lifetime, 2 more iterations, walking us literally through history as he observes and experiences and interacts with it. So, as a result of the very first slave narrative of his story, the first edition, he meets so many different people. This is a man whose first book will bring him into contact with presidents, with writers, with a movement that is afoot in the United States, and with a civil war that almost ripped our nation, our young nation, strictly apart. And so he will walk with Abraham Lincoln through the Civil War, through emancipation, through the argument, the dialectic that he and Lincoln had about whether to enlist or not to enlist black men, former slaves, freeing them and free men. He will strike up a friendship with the Langdon family, who will ultimately be part of the Samuel Clemens family or Mark Twain. Jervis Langdon will be a conductor on the Underground Railroad who will help Douglass escape slavery, and they will remain fast friends for the rest of Langdon's life. Samuel Clemens comes in as a result of associating with the Langdons, and he understands and is put into contact, into a community of conversation and dialectics with those of color, not just Frederick Douglass, but others. But it is Frederick Douglass who opens that door into Sam's mind and changes his mindset of what he thought was true, but now what he can see for himself and ask questions. This man, Frederick Douglass, will be a part and parcel of the reconstruction of the United States of America. He will continue his work with the women's movement. A famous speech on women's suffrage that he will give in Washington, D.C. in 1888 will be a part of this extension. His other government work alongside of Abraham Lincoln will put him in line with 3 other presidents. Think about that. How many of us have never met any president of the United States? Frederick Douglass not only meets them, he confers with them. They help him move forward to help his people and to help his American people on all sides of the tracks. So he will meet Ulysses S. Grant, who appoints Douglass as the first commissioner to investigate the possible annexation of the Dominican Republic to the United States. That had never happened before. Later, when Rutherford B. Hayes comes, he will meet with Rutherford B. Hayes and be appointed the very first marshal for the Justice Department. Later, he will meet Garfield because, wait for it, Sam Clemens, Mark Twain, writes a letter to Garfield saying that please don't read this recommendation as I am Mark Twain. I am writing this as Samuel Clemens for my friend whom I respect. And I would have written it for him even if I hadn't known him, but just known about his works. You'll have a copy of that for your students. I'm not pushing Mark Twain as much as I'm saying, think about it. Frederick Douglass lived a lifetime before the 1900s, from a slave child, a baby, slave boy, slave teen, slave man to freed man, and becoming an activist, an orator, a writer, a publisher, and meeting all of these people. He will impact others, just like Anna Julia Cooper, one of my favorite heroes slash heroine, a thinker, a writer, an educator who quotes from Douglass when she talks about woman's cause is one and universal. And in the 21st century, when we come back, we will talk about how Frederick Douglass still resonates with 20th and 21st century people. And this is what this program with the Library of Congress and C-SPAN is all about, is how our past continues to inform our present. And if anything I'm learning along with Giovanni or John through all of this is we have to listen. That's all we have to do. We have to listen and read what they said. And I will tell you, we are learning so much more about not only our own country, but about the world and about ourselves from this man who started out in slavery with no choice, no voice, no presence. So join me back on the other side to hear what some of the 20th and 21st century people thought about Frederick Douglass. What if I asked you, what do Langston Hughes, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., former Attorney General John Ashcroft, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama have in common? Just think about that for 10 seconds. Okay. They have in common an adoration, admiration, and remembrance of Frederick Douglass. I bet you didn't know that. And the idea with Langston Hughes, Langston Hughes is in every text. They haven't taken him out yet across the country. So he's still there. But what some folks, many folks don't know is that Langston Hughes had an ongoing serial, an article in the Chicago Defender, and it was called Simple. And his Simple was like the Greeks and the Greco-Romans everyman. Simple had an opinion about everything, and he was always right. And this series, this article series, was very, very popular. And one had Simple's Arithmetic, the return of Simple. And in that, Simple explains to his colleagues, to his pals, how important some Americans who were Negroes were important. And in that list, Frederick Douglass is at the top. And what's important about Langston Hughes's including Frederick Douglass in his Simple articles is that that audience, that early 20th century Harlem Renaissance audience, would have been very much aware of Frederick Douglass and his import and impact in the 19th century. So putting him there in that list would have been, oh yeah, right, of course it's there. It would have been unusual had his name not been there. They would have noticed that. As we move forward, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. directly quotes Frederick Douglass in his The Other American speech. You'll have a copy of that, and some of the instructional strategies and so forth will involve that, along with former Attorney General John Ashcroft, who honors Frederick Douglass in one of his speeches on education in 2004. In addition to that, George W. Bush in June 2020 cites Douglass when he's talking about the George Floyd case. And I thought that was so interesting that he would bring back that George would, or forgive me, I shouldn't call former President Bush George, that former President George Bush would bring back the connection between Frederick Douglass and George Floyd. And as you read that passage that we will include, you'll see that it is a natural passage. And for President Bush to do that, to bring the history, the past, with a tremendous and traumatic moment in our time that involved an awful act, I thought was very, very interesting and very, very effective. And also, Barack Obama, former President Barack Obama, alludes to Frederick Douglass in his in one of his November 28th speeches, basically saying that the fight isn't over, that we still have to try to come together as Americans. I found that this grouping of these particular people, seemingly from disparate parts, seemingly from disparate experiences, all find a commonality in Frederick Douglass's words from his first narrative. And I think that because the narrative is required in the curricula, and that we know that elementary and middle school teachers have a little bit of wiggle room in terms of what they can include in the curriculum, we do go into excerpts that you might be able to include and might want to think about, especially because when you have this grouping of people who relied on Frederick Douglass, decided that, when you're writing or you're speaking, you have to choose which people you're going to quote, which people you're going to cite. And for these seemingly disparate people to all decide to cite Frederick Douglass, there's something there. There's a nugget there that we need to keep paying attention to. We keep coming back to it. So we're going to, in the instructions and strategies, try to give you some of those quotes, some of those excerpts so that you'll understand, and the speeches that we've related here to you, so you'll be able to see for elementary, middle, and high school. So the next two sections, of course, you know them very well, the strategies and then the primary and secondary resources. So here we come at it. What does it look like and how do I get it done? So the instructional and reading strategies this time will be just like we've done in the past, starting out with pre-reading in groups or individually. And you'll notice when you see it, this time I will actually say, try these particular passages and divide them among the students and let them have them, talk about them, go around, share with them, and then bring it back to the class for discussion. The autobiography is very long. Well, I shouldn't say very long. An 800-page book is very long. This one isn't very long, but if you're trying to put it into your curriculum and you don't have room, the excerpts work better than trying to read its entirety. And of course, age appropriateness. So as always, there will be some for 4th through 6th grade, some for middle school, and then high school, where it's generally taught in an excerpt in the American Literature Survey. But that doesn't mean that 12th graders or 10th graders cannot benefit from reading some of these passages, not just because of the writing style or the fact that it's Frederick Douglass, but because of the message and helping students understand, showing them real writing, expository writing, nonfiction writing that is also artistic or stylistic, or for social studies, the historical impact. So that's really important. In addition to the reading, we talk about how to help students look at how they can improve or think about their own writing by looking at the various writing styles that Douglass includes in his work. And it's one thing to memorize some of these figures of speech and punctuation marks and so forth. It's something else to see a real writer using them and then allowing your students to do that. So we have some interesting activities that are sort of, in a sense, not outside the box, but not the typical write the essay, give me the essay, let me grade the essay, and I'm giving the essay back and we move on. There will be none of that. But it's all interactive, and we do span elementary through high school. And in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking of the pre-service teachers, whether they're history or social studies, because these will help you too. I remember what it was like going into teaching the very first time without that background. I thought I had the background. I did have a solid background, but not about teaching it. I knew the content, but it's different in knowing the content and understanding how to teach the content. So this is also for pre-service teachers as well. So enjoy the instructional and reading strategies. There are quite a few. Again, we will include activities that will necessarily use the quotes from the 20th and 21st centuries in comparison and contrast to the 19th. So there will be quite a few activities. You will not have to think about that there's a dearth. You didn't give us enough, Chadwick, Grassie, but we are giving you enough, and we're always willing to give you more. So we hope that you enjoy them. as we all know, required in our curricula around the country for elementary, middle, and secondary begins the fomenting of research and full-fledged research by the time they're in high school. So we always provide the primary and secondary resources, beginning, of course, with the Library of Congress and C-SPAN. Again, an amazing timetable is included in the hyperlinks for you with Frederick Douglass, along with other libraries and websites and the C-SPAN video on Frederick Douglass. That, of course, those are at the top. The other resources are those which, as classroom teachers, whether we're history or social studies, we always want to try and get the best possible resources. Sometimes our libraries have them, sometimes they don't, sometimes, we go out of pocket and we buy it. But we're giving you some of these that you can't buy. For example, you will have images of slave documents that we actually own, and some that we've gotten from the Library of Congress. You'll have all of the contents of, for example, The Atlantic put out an entire issue on the Civil War, and including all the players at that time. So you'll have that link. And any number of speeches will be recreated with the links. You'll have the links to go to those specific speeches of those people in the 19th century and 20th and 21st century connections. We have hyperlinked them, so you will be able to go to them without having to search and try and find and so forth. So the primary, secondary resources are at your disposal, and we will make sure they'll have a little précis to help you figure out if you want to use this one today or not today or next year or not this year. You'll know exactly where you're going with it. So again, the primary, secondary resources, critical, very critical, and they will be at your fingertips. Enjoy. Coming up, for the first time, and probably for the only time, I have an afterword that I think I have to do. We began this session talking about the difference between biography and autobiography. And I explained that, to me, Frederick Douglass's autobiography is not only first person, but it is also third person observant. And that's so important because rather than someone else telling his story, he is telling his own story. And he does it in 3 installments, with the second 2 building on this one. This is the foundation of his story, his life experience in the United States of America, both South and North and abroad. And that's unique. And so I wanted to take a moment to read to you about his decision to run and how frightened he was, but yet determined. And you remember I said to you, when I talk to students about slavery, they will say, well, why didn't they just get up and run? Well, that wasn't so easy, and I would like, just humor me, and let me just read this passage to you. The love of them was my tender point, and shook my decision more than anything else. The community of slaves, his family, his slave family. Besides the pain of separation, the dread and apprehension of a failure exceeded what I had experienced at my first attempt. The appalling defeat I then sustained returned to torment me. I felt assured that if I failed in this attempt, my case would be a hopeless one. It would seal my fate as a slave forever. I could not hope to get off with anything less than the severest punishment and being placed beyond the means of escape. It required no very vivid imagination to depict the most frightful scenes through which I should have to pass in case I failed. The wretchedness of slavery and the blessedness of freedom were perpetually before me. It was life and death with me. But I remained firm, and according to my resolution, on the 3rd day of September 1838, I left my chains and succeeded in reaching New York without the slightest interruption of any kind. How I did so, what means I adopted, what direction I traveled, and by what mode of conveyance, I must leave unexplained for the reasons before mentioned. It was a moment of the highest excitement I ever experienced. I suppose I felt as one may imagine the unarmed mariner to feel when he is rescued by a friendly man of war from the pursuit of a pirate. That's Frederick Douglass's firsthand experience of running, to run or not to run, the consequences of running, the idea of what would most assuredly happen, even if you, as you're listening to us now, think, well, they would have whipped him, they would have done this. You cannot even begin to imagine what horrors awaited them if they were caught. And mercifully not by the dogs. And that mercifully is definitely in quotation marks, because what lay in wait for them on those plantations when they returned was in so many ways a living death. And so here are his thoughts as he is making that decision. And more importantly, he refuses to reveal in this autobiography or the two succeeding ones how he did it. Again, the Underground Railroad, the conductors, the conveyances. You don't betray your aces. And so that's what he does. And later on, he does it again. Douglass would live to become a publisher of several newspapers. And at the beginning of the Civil War, his Douglass Monthly was distributed not only in the United States, but abroad. So he was a black publisher whose work, his journals, his newspapers were being read internationally. And please remember that. It's at the beginning when he realizes that everything is going to happen and the war is going to start that he decides to close shop. His sons are in the military and he is going to give his best to his country. In his what he calls the valedictory, I want to read this, his valedictory. Reason, argument, appeal, all moral influences have been applied in vain. The oppression has hardened his heart, blinded his mind, and deliberately rushed upon merited destruction. Let his blood be upon his own head, that I should take some humble part in the physical as well as the moral struggle against slavery and urge my long enslaved people to vindicate their manhood by bravely striking for their liberty and country is natural and consistent. I have indicated my course. You may not approve it, but I am sure you will appreciate the convictions of duty which impel me to it. With a full heart and warm with gratitude to you for all that you have done in furtherance of the cause of those to whom I have devoted my life, I bid you an affectionate farewell. Frederick Douglass, Rochester, New York, August 16, 1863. This is his valedictory in the Douglasses Monthly. From this point on, Frederick Douglass will, as he says, be tireless on the lecture circuit, in trying to help the military, in trying to talk and plan with Abraham Lincoln. He will be ardent. He will be passionate. And his footprints, his imprints, his strength, his vision, his passion continue to shape America to this very moment, at this very time, when we too are in somewhat of a conundrum in our country. Thank you